If you're watching this video, maybe it's too late for me. In recent years, I have investigated stories of priests who dared to defy powerful forces and paid with their lives. Now, I feel like I'm being followed. Will my story have the same ending? I don't know how much longer I can talk, but I need to share something that might change your view of the church, of the hidden power behind the scenes, and of what happens when a priest becomes a problem. The story of a consecrated man dressed in a cassock walking through the corridors of faith should be about devotion, service, and delivery. But what happens when that same man decides to face silence, challenge the structure, and talk about what shouldn't be said? The history of the Catholic Church is marked by moments of light and shadows, and it is in these shadows that many secrets rest, secrets that, when brought to light, exact a price. In Palermo, 1993, a priest did just that. Father Pino Puglisi challenged what seemed to be untouchable, the mafia. He did not remain silent in the face of oppression. He did not close his eyes to the crimes committed in his community, and he did not accept the silent complicity of the church itself. On his birthday, the answer came in the form of lead, a well-aimed shot, a fallen body, and an enigmatic smile that haunts his killer to this day. Why? What goes on in the mind of a man who faces death with a smile on his lips? What did he know that made him so feared? Decades earlier, in El Salvador, Archbishop Oscar Romero knew he was signed to die. He not only confronted government abuses, but also denounced injustices within the church itself. His sermons became a nuisance, his words a problem. The day has arrived. The bell rang and the mass went on as usual until a gunshot interrupted the sacred ritual. The blood mixed with the altar wine, a clear warning to any other priest who thought of standing up against the system. But the pattern repeats itself. The Vatican is silent. Investigations are lost in bureaucracy. And the killers, many were not even tried. The church, which should be the refuge of the wronged, seems, in some cases, to seal the fate of those who dare to speak too much with silence. In 2000, in Kenya, Father John Kaiser was found dead on the side of the road, shot in the head. The official report? Suicide. But anyone who knows his trajectory knows that this was not a real possibility. He had already warned his friends, "If you ever find me dead, don't believe what they say." Why would a man make a statement like that? What did he know that put him in so much danger? The same happened in 2011 in Colombia. Father José Reynel Restrepo opposed powerful illegal mining interests. Days later, he was dead. His motorcycle, his faithful companion on visits to the community, mysteriously appeared in another city, as if someone wanted to erase any trace of his last journey. But the pattern is always the same. A priest who refuses to remain silent, a denunciation against those who cannot be challenged, a body found, an enforced silence. And now I wonder, is there a pattern to these murders? A priest should be a spiritual guide, a moral leader, a beacon in the midst of darkness. But what happens when he becomes a threat to those living in the shadows? I feel like there's something bigger in all of this, a network of power that grows stronger in silence and fear. And me? I hesitated before recording this video. I looked around, checked the reflection of the windows, walked carefully, because I know that if there is something that bothers those who dominate the system, it is the truth. But I needed to do this. Perhaps the Vatican knows more than it says. Perhaps these deaths are not just isolated tragedies, but pieces of a larger game. Reports are filed, witnesses disappear, evidence disappears. What happens when someone tries to break this cycle? What happens when someone refuses to bow their head? I'm not naive. I know I'm touching wounds that many would prefer to keep closed. I know I'm treading on dangerous territory, but if something happens to me, you already know why. If history repeats itself, if my name is just another on a list of silenced people, remember everything I said here. Because in the end, the truth only needs one thing to survive: someone to have the courage to tell it. And now I need to know what you think about all this. Do you believe that these cases were just coincidences, or that there is something much bigger behind these deaths? Do you think the church hides more secrets than it reveals? I want to hear your opinion. Leave your comment below. Your voice may be more important than you realize. If we are talking about a network of power that silences those who dare to challenge the system, then speaking, sharing, and questioning can be the first step to breaking this cycle. Don't let these stories fade into oblivion. Every priest who lost his life for daring to speak the truth deserves to be remembered. Each of them carried a message that cannot be buried with their bodies. So tell me, which of these stories has impacted you? Have you heard of other similar cases? Share your opinion of what I'm going to tell you in the comments. Let's create a space where the truth cannot be erased so easily. Strange. As if for a second he was not faced with an ordinary man, but someone who knew exactly what was coming. What makes a priest face a criminal empire knowing that he could be killed at any moment? What was Father Pino Puglisi's secret? Did he believe his faith would protect him, or did he simply know he was doomed from the moment he decided to defy the mafia? Palermo in the early 90s was a city ruled by fear. Cosa Nostra, the powerful Sicilian criminal organization, dominated not only illicit businesses, but also the region's culture itself. Silence was enforced with blood, and those who dared to defy them simply disappeared. Many priests preferred to keep their distance, avoiding getting involved in something that was clearly beyond their control. But Pino Puglisi wasn't like the others. He saw the suffering of children, young people being recruited into crime, families living under constant threat, and for him, omission was not an option. Father Puglisi knew he was messing with a system that didn't forgive, but that didn't make him back down. On the contrary, he decided to fight the mafia where it hurt most, at the base. Instead of trying to take down crime bosses directly, he focused on preventing the next generation from being sucked into this world. He created social projects, offered education, and new opportunities for young people who, without this, would have had an inevitable fate of crime, and that was his death sentence. The mafia understood that the best way to maintain power was to ensure a constant flow of new members. Anyone who interfered in this became a real threat. The messages started to arrive. First, subtle warnings, then direct threats. But Pino Puglisi didn't back down. He knew that by defying a system like that, his life was at risk. But what if it wasn't just the mafia that wanted his silence? What if there were other interests involved? It is impossible to ignore the fact that within the church itself, there were those who preferred not to see a priest picking this fight. After all, the relationship between organized crime and religious institutions has always been a murky terrain where unlikely alliances could be formed. On September 15th, 1993, the day he turned 56, Puglisi was returning home when he was approached. The killer approached, took out his gun, and pointed it at him. Instead of despair, instead of trying to escape, the priest simply smiled. A smile that disconcerted his killer. Then the shot. A single, accurate shot. The body fell, but its death did not bring silence. On the contrary, his execution caught the world's attention, exposed the cowardice of his enemies, and turned his story into a symbol of resistance. But there is something unsettling about this story. Why didn't a priest who clearly knew he was going to die try to escape, didn't ask for protection, didn't seek support from the church itself? Did he know something he never revealed? What was going on in Pino Puglisi's mind in his last days? Had he received any warning? There are those who say that his last sermons had a farewell tone, as if he already knew that his time was running out. But was he scared? The mafia doesn't usually leave traces, but in this case something was different. Those responsible for his death were found, tried, and convicted. This is unusual. Many other murders committed by the organization remain unsolved to this day. So why, in this specific case, did the investigations move so quickly? Could it have been a way of trying to close the case too quickly to avoid uncomfortable questions? After all, how many other priests were threatened and ended up dead, without any kind of justice? It is impossible to ignore the fact that throughout history, whenever a priest becomes a problem, his death ends up being justified as the fate of those who get too involved. But are these deaths just isolated tragedies, or are they part of a larger pattern? When a religious leader decides to challenge powerful forces, does the church protect him or abandon him to his fate? And now I ask, what do you think of this story? Do you believe that Pino Puglisi's death was just a natural consequence of his fight against the mafia? Or do you think there was something more to it? Was he betrayed? Was there someone within the church who would rather see him dead than see him continue his work? The scene was shocking. The silence was broken by the sharp crack of the gunshot, followed by the muffled sound of the archbishop's body hitting the ground. The blood, hot and alive, stained the alb and the stole, ran down the altar and mixed with the sacred wine, as if the communion itself was dyed with the price of its boldness. Oscar Romero knew he was signing his death warrant the moment he chose to challenge the powerful, but, like other priests who dared to raise his voice against injustice, he did not back down. What drives a man to face the inevitable, knowing that his destiny has already been set? El Salvador, in 1980, was a powder keg ready to explode. The military dictatorship controlled everything with an iron fist, crushing any form of resistance. Violence spread through the streets, activists disappeared without a trace, and those who dared to challenge the regime were brutally eliminated. The church, which should be the refuge of the oppressed, in many cases became an accomplice to terror, remaining silent in the face of atrocities committed by the state. But Romero couldn't ignore the screams of the people, the bodies scattered in the streets, the mothers who cried for children who would never return home. He understood that his role as a religious leader was not just to console, but to denounce, to bring to light what many wanted to keep in the shadows. His voice started to bother him. He spoke in his homilies about human dignity, about the rights of the poor, about the need for justice in a country sunk in corruption and repression. And this was unacceptable to those in power. The government knew that a charismatic religious leader with the courage to stand up against oppression was more dangerous than any armed guerrilla. Romero didn't carry rifles, but his words had enough power to move the masses, to make those who lived in fear begin to believe that there was hope. The threats were not long in coming. Anonymous messages, sinister phone calls, suspicious looks during masses. Friends and allies warned him, told him that he should flee, that his life was hanging in the balance. But he didn't run away. He believed his mission was more important than his safety. "If they kill me, I will be resurrected among the Salvadoran people," he said, and he continued to preach, continued to denounce, continued to bother, until the fateful day arrived. March 24th, 1980. It was a hot afternoon, and Romero was celebrating Mass in the chapel of the Divina Providencia Hospital. The ceremony was going on as usual, but something in the air felt different. Some believers noticed a strange movement in the surroundings, unknown men circulating around the area, but no one imagined what was about to happen. At the time of the consecration, when Romero raised the chalice, a sniper positioned outside the chapel took aim and pulled the trigger. The projectile passed through the open door and found its target with surgical precision. The impact was devastating. The archbishop staggered, clutched his chest, and fell in front of the astonished faithful. Panic took over the environment. Screams, running, desperate believers trying to help him. But there was nothing to be done. Oscar Romero was dead. What happened? Next was even more disturbing. Instead of a rigorous investigation, instead of justice, what we saw was a coordinated effort to cover up those responsible. The authorities treated the case as another incident, insinuating that the archbishop had caused his own death by getting involved in political issues. The church, in turn, divided. Some priests and bishops praised him as a martyr, while others, aligned with the government, avoided talking about his death as if he had never existed. The truth is that Romero was dangerous because he exposed something that many wanted to hide: the complicity between the government and sectors of the church in the massacre of the population. He denounced priests who blessed soldiers before going to kill peasants. He talked about bishops who feasted with the generals while the people starved. He was disturbing because he showed that the problem was not just in the government, but within the religious structure itself. And this is where the big question arises. To what extent did the church know what was going to happen? Was there someone within the clergy itself who wanted Romero dead? It would not be the first time that religious figures were eliminated by forces that, in theory, should protect them. When a priest becomes a problem, does the Vatican defend him or sacrifice him? The scariest thing is that his death was not an isolated case. In the following years, countless religious who continued their mission were killed. Nuns, priests, catechists, all those who dared to denounce injustice were silenced. Many were kidnapped, tortured, and thrown into mass graves. Government forces wanted to erase any trace of resistance, and the church, with rare exceptions, did nothing to stop it. Decades later, the question still remains: who ordered Oscar Romero to be killed? The killer pulled the trigger, but who gave the order? Who, within the power structure, decided he needed to die? His murder was not just an act of violence, but a clear message to anyone who thought of following his path. The body was there, lying on the side of the road, as if it had been discarded, worthless, as if its entire life had been reduced to a soulless body left in the middle of nowhere. The official report would say it was suicide, but there was something wrong. There was something that didn't fit. John Kaiser was not a man who gave up. He was not someone who would simply give up without a fight. Quite the opposite. He knew he was in danger. He knew he was bothering powerful people, and he had already made it clear, if one day he was found dead, no one should believe the official version. But the question is, who would be so interested in silencing him? The Kenyan government, the church itself, or both? John Kaiser was not just another priest. He was a man who understood the true role of faith. It was not just about saying masses and blessing the faithful, but about protecting the vulnerable, denouncing injustices, and confronting those who used their power to oppress. And that's exactly what he did. For years, he exposed crimes that most preferred to ignore. He spoke out against corruption, denounced the abuse of power, and most dangerous of all, revealed the shadowy connections between the government and influential figures within the church itself. This made him a target. He knew that. I constantly received threats. He was followed. His name was on lists of inconvenient people. But even so, it continued. He believed that the truth needed to be told, no matter the cost. The murder of John Kaiser was not an isolated event. It was part of something bigger, part of a pattern that repeated itself throughout history. Priests who dare to challenge the powerful, who refuse to turn a blind eye to the crimes committed around them, suddenly suffer accidents, disappear, or are found dead under mysterious circumstances. And there is always an official report trying to close the case quickly, trying to convince the public that there is nothing wrong, that it was all just an unfortunate coincidence. But what happens when the coincidence repeats itself so many times that it becomes impossible to ignore? In Kaiser's case, the inconsistencies were glaring. The crime scene looked staged. The body was found with a gunshot wound to the head, a classic execution, not a suicide. The revolver was there, as if it had been carefully placed next to him to reinforce the official version. But there was something strange about the details, the way everything was presented. Witnesses reported that he had been persecuted in the previous days. Close friends said he showed no signs of depression, that he was not the kind of man who would give himself up. On the contrary, he was determined to continue his denunciations, but suddenly, out of nowhere, had he decided to end his own life. Hard to believe. And who really benefited from his death? The Kenyan government was, at that time, involved in a series of corruption scandals, human rights violations, and brutal repression against opponents. Kaiser had spoken publicly about this. He had accused members of the government of being involved in extrajudicial executions and massacres against entire communities. But he didn't stop there. He also raised suspicions about the church's relationship with these crimes, about how certain religious leaders seemed conniving, turning a blind eye to the atrocities happening before them. And this is where the situation becomes even more complicated, because when a priest becomes a problem for both the government and the church, he has nowhere to run. There is no protection, there is no refuge. He becomes a man alone, surrounded by invisible enemies, watched, monitored. And when the time is right, when the nuisance it causes becomes too great, it is eliminated. And the most shocking thing of all is that, after his death, silence sets in. The church does not mobilize. The Vatican does not demand answers. The government quickly drops the case, and society, anesthetized by so many other scandals, simply forgets. But we cannot forget. We cannot simply accept the official version and move on as if nothing had happened. John Kaiser was killed because he spoke the truth, because it exposed what many wanted to keep hidden. He paid the price that so many others before him also paid. But if history has taught us anything, it's that silence never lasts forever. There are always those who keep questioning, who keep looking for answers, who refuse to accept the lies told by those in power. The body of Father José Reynel Restrepo was found on a deserted road in Colombia, abandoned as if his life had no value. A clear shot, no signs of struggle, no witnesses. But anyone who knew his story knew that this was not a simple crime. He had already been threatened for months because he dared to face forces that seemed unattainable. In a country where organized crime infiltrates all levels of society, challenging millionaire interests was a death sentence, and Restrepo knew it. But like other priests who came before him, he refused to remain silent. He believed his mission went beyond the walls of the church, and for that, he paid the price. In the small town of Marmato, where he served, the problem was clear. Illegal mining companies were devastating the land, expelling families, destroying entire communities, and operating without any control. And the church, traditionally, has always maintained a neutral stance in the face of these conflicts. But Restrepo couldn't watch all this without taking action. He began to publicly denounce what was happening, condemning the violence used against the peasants and criticizing the powerful who profited from the destruction. The region's residents saw him as a leader, a man who was willing to speak up for those who had no voice. But the mine owners saw a problem, and problems need to be solved. The threats began discreetly, like veiled warnings in casual conversations. Then came the more direct messages. People told him to stop, to leave the city, to mind his own business. But Restrepo didn't stop. He believed that the church had a role to play, that it was not enough to say masses and offer spiritual comfort if, outside, the community was being massacred. He talked about justice, about ethics, about abuses committed in the name of profit, and then, one day, he disappeared. His body was found kilometers away from the city. His motorcycle, which he used every day, appeared in another location, as if someone was trying to create a false narrative, confuse the investigations, and hinder any attempt to find the truth. But who really wanted his death? Were it the business people who would lose money with their complaints? Was it the paramilitary groups that controlled part of the region? Or was there something even deeper, something that involved not only organized crime but also the church itself? The truth is that Restrepo was not the first priest to be killed for challenging the interests of the elite, and it wasn't the last either. Over the years, Latin America has seen several priests murdered for refusing to comply with injustice. But whenever this happens, the investigations follow a disturbing pattern. Conflicting versions quickly emerge. Rumors emerge that perhaps it was a common crime, a robbery, a disturbance. There is always an effort to remove the political weight of crime, to make it seem like something banal, an unfortunate accident. And there is always silence. The Church, throughout history, has demonstrated ambiguous reactions in these cases. At times, he canonizes murdered priests, transforming them into martyrs. In others, they pretend that nothing happened, avoid friction, and refuse to face those truly responsible. And this raises an important question. To what extent does the institution itself protect those who really fight for justice? To what extent is the Church hierarchy willing to challenge those who wield power in brutal ways? The case of José Reynel Restrepo raises many questions. Why did a priest who was just defending his community pose such a threat? What exactly did he know? Who benefited from his death? These are questions that will probably never have official answers. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep asking. On the contrary, this is exactly why we need to talk about these stories. Because every time a crime like this falls into oblivion, every time we accept an official version without question, we are allowing it to happen again. And that's why I need to know what you think. Do you believe that Father José Reynel Restrepo's death was just another unsolved crime? Or do you think he was silenced because he knew too much? Have you heard of other similar cases? Do you believe the Church should have done more to protect you? Tell me in the comments. Your opinion is essential so that these stories are not buried along with those who lost their lives for speaking the truth. And if you've made it this far, I know this story has impacted you in some way. So take this moment to leave your like. This helps the video reach more people so that more people are aware of this reality. If you believe the truth needs to be told, click the like button right now, because the more people know about these stories, the harder it will be for those who try to hide them. The feeling of being watched, the discomfort of knowing that words have weight, that truths are uncomfortable, that there are forces that prefer silence. That's what I feel when I dive into these stories. These are not just reports of dead priests. They are not just isolated cases of religious people who faced power and paid with their lives. There is something more, something that repeats itself in eerily similar patterns, something that makes us question whether these deaths were just tragedies or whether they are part of a much larger cycle. A cycle that is kept alive because those who talk too much always end up meeting the same fate. It's not easy to talk about this. Each name mentioned here carries a load of danger, not because the dead can harm me, but because those who continue to operate in the shadows, those who still hold power, may feel that I am crossing a line that should not be crossed. What happens when someone starts connecting the dots? What happens when the silence, so carefully constructed over the years, is broken? History has shown us countless times. The pattern is always the same. Priests who become uncomfortable, who denounce something bigger than themselves, who challenge governments, mafiosi, businessmen, and in some cases, even figures within the Church. First, the veiled threats. Strange looks, silent phone calls, notes left anonymously. Then, the more direct warnings. Father, you better stop. That's not your problem. You are messing with dangerous people. When the threat has no effect, attempts to discredit it come. False accusations, rumors spread, attempts to tarnish the priest's reputation so that if something happens to him, no one will care. But when none of this works, when the priest insists on continuing, his fate becomes predictable. It was like that with Pino Puglisi. It was like that with Oscar Romero. It was like that with John Kaiser. It was like that with José Reynel Restrepo. Everyone knew they were bothering powerful people. Everyone knew they were being followed. Everyone knew they were living their last days, and yet they moved on. But what happens after they die? What happens to those who try to move their stories forward? Because if there is something that power fears, it is memory. This is why there is always an effort to turn these murders into something banal, to have their deaths treated as just another tragedy. History repeats itself because the system works, because people forget, because fear is greater than the desire to seek the truth. And I wonder, how far will this go? How many more priests need to be silenced before something changes? How many others are already scarred, living with the certainty that their lives won't last long because they dared to say what they shouldn't have? And the most uncomfortable question of all, how many of these priests are being watched right now without knowing that their hours are numbered? It's not paranoia. It's not an exaggeration. These crimes have happened so many times that ignoring them would be naive. How many of these deaths could have been avoided if there had been more interest in protecting these priests, if there was more pressure for the real culprits to be punished? But the truth is that most of the time investigations lead nowhere. There is always an obstacle. There's always a witness who disappears. There's always a document that disappears. There is always someone who refuses to talk. And there are also those who try to distance themselves from these stories. Parts of the church itself that prefer not to get involved, that avoid bringing up the subject, that do not want its structures to be shaken. The Vatican rarely comments on these cases. At times, he recognizes these priests as martyrs. In others, it simply remains silent, allowing these stories to fade over time. But what if there is something more? What if, in addition to simply omitting itself, there are cases in which the church itself contributes to the disappearance of these troublesome priests? After all, there are always secrets that need to be kept, alliances that need to be preserved. The shadow of death hangs over those who talk too much, about those who challenge the structure, about those who do not accept the logic of silence. And if this shadow has already taken so many, why would it stop now? There is no reason to believe that these murders are a thing of the past. If it happened before, it happens now. If it happened to them, it could happen to others. And if you've made it this far, if this story has made you uncomfortable, if you feel like something is wrong and needs to be exposed, I need your help. Comment here what you think about all this. Do you believe that these priests were killed just by chance? Or do you think there is something much bigger behind these stories? Do you think these deaths will continue to happen, or that there is still a way to stop this cycle? Tell me in the comments. Your voice matters more than you realize. And don't forget, leave your like. This helps this video reach more people. Spread this story so that more people start to question it, so that this pattern does not continue to be ignored. If you believe the truth needs to be told, hit the like button right now. The history of the Catholic Church has always been surrounded by mysteries, closely guarded secrets, events that were simply swept under the rug. When a priest is murdered after challenging political powers, criminals, or even figures within the institution itself, the official explanation is almost always the same: an isolated crime with no connection to anything larger, without conspiracy. But is that really it? Does the Vatican, one of the most powerful and influential institutions in the world, really know nothing? Or do you know more than you're willing to admit? After all, the church has a highly organized command structure. Nothing happens without at least someone at higher levels knowing about it. When a priest is killed for talking too much, it's hard to believe that no one within the hierarchy had any inkling of the danger he was in. The question that needs to be asked is, why were these priests not protected? Why, in many cases, has the church itself preferred silence rather than demanding justice? Pino Puglisi was threatened several times before being murdered by the mafia in Italy. Oscar Romero knew he was marked for death for denouncing the violence in El Salvador. John Kaiser had already said publicly that if he were found dead, no one should believe the official version. José Reynel Restrepo was also targeted by criminals before being executed. In all of these cases, there were signs, warnings that something was going to happen, and yet nothing was done to protect them. Were these deaths just unfortunate fatalities, or were there people within the church itself who preferred to see these priests dead rather than alive, continuing with their denunciations? The Vatican has centuries of experience dealing with scandals. When something threatens the image of the church, the priority almost always seems to be controlling the narrative and not necessarily seeking the truth. This was the case in cases of abuse committed by clergy, which for years were ignored, hushed up, and in many cases covered up. This was the case in cases of financial corruption that linked high-ranking church figures to suspicious operations involving banks and influential politicians. And it was like this in countless moments in history, where the institution preferred to protect its reputation rather than face problems head-on. If the church was able to hide internal crimes for so long, why should it be any different when the matter involves priests who have become a nuisance? When a priest begins to denounce what should not be denounced, he becomes a problem. And the church, like any other powerful institution, knows very well how to deal with problems. Sometimes she simply walks away, letting the problem resolve itself without interfering directly. Other times, she can even collaborate, ensuring that investigations never progress, that those truly responsible are never identified. The truth is that in many of these cases, the investigations were abruptly interrupted. Witnesses disappeared, documents were lost, police officers responsible for investigations were removed. Everything seems to follow a carefully planned script, where the main objective is not to find the truth, but to prevent the right questions from being asked. What does the church gain from this? Perhaps maintain alliances that you consider strategic. Maybe prevent something even bigger from coming to light. Maybe you just don't want your own secrets exposed in the process. And if there's one thing the Vatican has learned over the centuries, it's that the best way to control a crisis is through storytelling. It doesn't matter what actually happened. What matters is the official version, the one that will be accepted by the public, the one that will be repeated until any other possibility seems like a conspiracy theory. And the official version always tries to minimize the impact of these murders. They are treated as individual tragedies, disconnected from each other. But are they really? If there is something that is repeated in all these cases, it is the pattern of silence and impunity. The true masterminds of the murders are never identified and never brought to justice. Priests are killed in brutal ways, but the church continues as if nothing had happened. At most, he performs ceremonies in memory of the deceased, exalts their courage, talks about sacrifice. But what about justice and punishment for the guilty? This rarely happens. And that brings us to an even scarier question. Are there priests alive right now within the church who know they are marked for death? Priests who are perhaps investigating something they shouldn't, reporting something they can't? Could it be that right now there are priests living in fear, waiting for the day when they will receive a direct threat, an unexpected visit, a warning that they are getting too close to the truth? The Vatican is an ancient institution. It survived empires, wars, revolutions. It has always adapted to changes in the world, but has always preserved its own system of power. And part of that power comes from controlling information, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to just observe, when to protect and when to simply ignore. And the truth is that these deaths never generated a reaction strong enough to change anything within the church. There was no real mobilization to ensure that priests like these were never murdered again. There were no structural reforms that would prevent this from happening again. And if something is repeated so many times without concrete measures being taken, the only possible conclusion is that this pattern doesn't bother those in charge that much. For days, I feel like I'm being watched. I can't explain exactly when it started, but there's something in the air, an invisible presence that follows me wherever I go. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. Who, after all, would care about another video on the internet? Who would waste time monitoring someone who only talks about stories that have already happened? But then came the signs, small, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. Strange messages, notifications of attempts to access my accounts, a car parked near my house for too long. Coincidence? Perhaps. But if there's anything I've learned from studying these stories, it's that when you start to get uncomfortable, coincidences cease to exist. I hesitated before recording this video. I thought about giving up. I thought about erasing everything and moving on with my life as if nothing had happened. But that would be exactly what they want, wouldn't it? The silence. The same strategy. Used so many times. Omit, suffocate, ignore until the questions stop being asked, until the dust settles and everything returns to normal. But what if I don't want everything to go back to normal? What if I'm not willing to close my eyes and pretend I don't see what's happening? History always repeats itself. Priests who dare to speak too much end up dead. Pino Puglisi defied the mafia and paid the price with a bullet to the heart. Oscar Romero denounced the brutality of the El Salvador government and was murdered in the middle of Mass. John Kaiser warned that he would be killed, and his body appeared on the side of a road in an alleged suicide that no one believed. José Reynel Restrepo opposed millionaire interests, and shortly after, he was found dead, his motorcycle taken to another city as if someone was trying to erase his last steps. And now, I ask myself, am I walking this same path? Could it be that by talking about these cases, by connecting the dots that many prefer to ignore, am I making myself a problem? There is something these stories have in common, and it is not just the courage of the priests who dared to challenge power. The pattern that repeats itself is not just in the way they lived, but in the way they were silenced. The modus operandi is always the same. First, surveillance, then the threats. And if that's not enough, then comes the inevitable fate, an accident, a disguised murder, an unexplained disappearance. If something happens to me, you will know why. And this is perhaps the scariest part. It's not just about what has already happened, it's about what's yet to come. Because if these deaths had just been isolated tragedies, if they had just been the result of random events, then none of this would be happening again now. But here we are, decades later, talking about the same stories, feeling the same weight, noticing the same signs. This means that the cycle has not yet been broken. It means there are still forces operating in the shadows, ensuring that certain truths are never fully exposed. And the truth is uncomfortable. It always bothered, especially when it affects those who prefer to act without being noticed, those who benefit from ignorance and fear. When a priest denounces corruption, violence, abuse within the church itself, he becomes a problem because he threatens not just a group, but an entire system. When someone starts talking about these connections, about how everything is interconnected, that person also becomes a target. I know I'm not the first to question all of this. I know there were others before me who tried to understand, who tried to expose. Some disappeared, others gave up, others were simply ignored. But what if this time is different? What if this time the truth can no longer be suppressed? If something happens to me, I want you to keep asking. I want you to keep talking about this. Don't let this video be just another lost on the internet. Don't let this story be buried with me, because that's exactly what they want. I need to go. I can't stay here anymore. Something happened a few hours ago that made me realize I was past the point of no return. I know I'm already upsetting people who would prefer this video had never been recorded. I can't give many details, but there was a moment today when I knew for sure someone is watching me. It's not just strange messages or suspicious notifications. It's real. I felt it. A car that had been parked on the street since early in the morning. A shadow that appeared and disappeared around the corner as I left the house. Strange sounds in the middle of the night, as if someone was there, watching. I knew this day would come. I need to hide. I don't know for how long. I don't know if this will be enough. Maybe when you're watching this video, I no longer have access to this channel. Maybe this will be the last time I can talk to you. If so, remember, I warned you. If something happens to me, don't accept easy explanations. Don't believe the first version that comes out. Investigate, talk about it. Don't let this story die with me. I don't know if I'll come out alive after this, but if there's anything I've learned throughout this entire investigation, it's that the truth always finds a way to survive. As long as there are those who ask, as long as there are those who doubt, as long as there are those who keep talking, they will never have complete control. If I disappear, if this video is deleted, if I'm suddenly silenced, I want you who are watching right now to make a choice. Choose to continue questioning. Choose not to accept silence as an answer. Choose to keep this discussion alive. And now, more than ever, I need you to leave a like. It's not a simple button. It's not just an automatic action. It's a way of showing that this story needs to be heard, that there are people who care. That silence did not win. If you believe the truth needs to be told, hit the like button right now and share this video. Because after today, I don't know if I can do this again.